Well, hi guys. First, I think it's first off, thank y'all for coming. It's greatly appreciated. I hope this meeting is at least somewhat profitable for you. We're gonna do things a little differently than a typical RC meeting, so I think it'll be fun. A little spice it up at the end. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. Also, I find it really funny that like the section farthest from me as possible is the populated section. Like nothing over here, nothing over here. Like I just think it's silly. Fair enough.
This is just like the usual RC seating right.
I know, it's odd. I'm like at church though, like I'm one of like the front row Baptists, so like the extra holy people, but you know. Okay, so this is that QR code that I think you have on that little sheet. Don't scan this yet. This is like a sign in, sign up type deal, but in it we ask you to rate the meeting, so we really should not put it on the front end, but that's where it is. So, whoops. Just scan the thing at the end and, flame me if you want. You can flame my style. I look like a golfer, whatever. So, welcome to Ratio Christi. If you haven't been to Ratio Christi, we are an apologetics organization on the campus of Texas A&M. And there's an overarching organization nationally that is committed to historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus. And so the whole idea is we educate ourselves so that we can be equipped to answer questions and use these to act out our faith and share our faith with others. Because it's not worth having a faith that is unfounded or untrue, right? Paul says if Christ was not resurrected, we shouldn't be following Jesus, right? So we want to know why we believe things and be able to share that with others. So that being said, nothing that I shouldn't go there yet. Technically, our branch of RC is called Think Theism. So stuff in this lecture is going to be endorsed by Think Theism, but may or may not be nationally endorsed by Ratio Christi as an organization. So don't go complaining to national. If you don't like what I say, just come complain to me. It's okay. But yeah, so today we're going to be going over this book called Tactics by Greg Koukl. It's essentially a book on how to talk. And so I think I talk one of the most in RC, so that's probably why they gave me this. I don't know that I'm good at it. But this whole book is about how to have conversations about your faith and about harder topics and navigate those conversations well, right? Because if somebody gets pissed off or like you just aren't an effective communicator, you're not going to be able to communicate your message. So we want to be able to navigate conversations with grace and poise and be able to do it in a loving way that advances the conversation and gets to the end we want to get at, right? And talks about what we want to talk about. But that being said, we want to make sure that our demeanor is in the correct place. So in Matthew 10, Jesus says, "Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." And so we want to guide the conversations, right? We want to be wise. We want to be not necessarily cunning, but we need to be aware and like alert of how the conversation's going. And essentially, because the end goal is we're trying to get in the driver's seat of the conversation to navigate where we want to go. But we don't want to be deceptive. We don't want to be dishonest, right? It's just oftentimes conversations can kind of spin in circles. And so we want to instead be gracious and loving and get the conversation to a productive spot, if that makes sense. So 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, "Therefore we are ambassadors for Christ. God makes his appeal through us, and we implore you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God." So Koukl argues that there's three things that you need to be an effective ambassador for Christ. You need knowledge. So that's what we're about here at Ratio Christi. We equip ourselves with the knowledge to advance the gospel, right? Why do you believe Jesus was resurrected from the dead? Why do you think there's a God of creation? Those sorts of things. And then tactical wisdom is the second point Koukl argues for, and that's mainly what we're going to be focused on today. And so how do we be wise in conversations and persuasive and know what to say and when to say it? And then character. If you're a Christian but you're a butthead, nobody's going to listen to you. So don't be a butthead, right? You want to be gracious. You want to be loving like Christ. And Jesus in the Gospels, oftentimes when people have doubts or things like that, he leads people on to get to the conclusion he wants them to get to, but he does it in a gracious and kind way. He's not like, "You idiot, I'm God, sit down," right? He instead is gracious and loving and kind in his speech. And so that's how we want to be. So This is a really solid quote. It is not the Christian life to wound, embarrass, or play one-upmanship with colleagues, friends, or even opponents, but it is a common vice that anyone can easily fall into. And so beating someone over the head with the Bible is not in accordance with Christian character, right? But when you have the ability to navigate conversations and you realize somebody doesn't necessarily know why they believe something, there can be a temptation to kind of like go in on that and like really pound it. And that is rude and demeaning. And so we don't want to do that, right? We want to be able to expose flaws in thinking with questions in a loving and gracious way so that that person can get at the truth, but we're not beating them with it. Make sense? Cool. So step one, for my psych majors in the room, this is the most important thing, right? Listening, right? You want to be able to listen to people, and you want to make sure that they feel like they're fully known by you. And then in addition to that, that helps you because you fully understand their argument. You're not going to be saying things that try to argue a straw man when that's not what they actually believe, right? So listen, be aware of what they're saying and what and how you can process that, and then communicate further with them. But you need to be listening first. So show of hands, who's kind of apprehensive? I've been using a lot of the terms like getting in the driver's seat, navigating the conversation, like kind of staying in charge. Anybody like apprehensive about those? Like sound kind of weird? Okay. We got like one or two. I guess the rest of y'all are just power hungry. That's cool. But it is biblically backed up. And so it's not necessarily like something that we need to be demeaning with or like a butt about. But we do want to be able to guide conversations, right? And so in 2 Timothy, Paul says, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us, and we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God, right? And then again in 2 Timothy, have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching, right? And so what do we see about this ambassadorship that Paul's arguing for, right? We see that it's one that's firm, it's one that's grounded in truth, right? Reproving, rebuking, and exhorting, encouraging, right? And so, but doing that from a basis of truth on which you stand on. And then patience and teaching. If someone doesn't understand or it's like falling on deaf ears, you're not yelling at them, you're not a street preacher. You're walking them through the word, and you're like, well, here's why I believe what I believe. This is the gospel. These are the reasons, right? And so we want to be firm in what we believe, but we want to be kind and gracious in how we have those conversations. Yeah? So an important disclaimer, you're a person. Romans would say that your throat is an open grave. You cannot argue someone to Jesus, right? Your words aren't good, but the righteousness of Christ works through us. And so we can pull out rocks from the field so seeds can be sown, but it's the Spirit that must do the work and must stir hearts. So 1 Corinthians 3:6 says, I planted, Apollos waters, but it is God that gives growth. So God changes the hearts. And I got to see this in a really cool way this summer. This is a little personal tangent. I was an impact counselor, and me, another counselor in our prayer teamer, kind of got pulled aside by this one guy, and he just had basically any theological question you can come up with, like all the big ones that are like the heavy hitters. And so we probably just sat there and talked and got to like answer this guy's questions for like 2 hours. And then an hour or so later, we all like go to the final impact camp time, like worship thing, whatever. And he ends up giving his life to Christ during worship, like kind of sitting in the corner, like not with, it wasn't us like trying to talk him into it and like argue him. Okay, now before you have any time to think, let's pray a prayer and accept Jesus and everybody's going to be happy, right? That's not what happened. We gave the reasons for what we believed. He thought about them, considered them, had an encounter with Jesus, and started following Christ. And then an hour or two after that, he pulled us aside again and like dumped his whole life story and all struggles out. So this isn't necessarily fruitless, right? I know a lot of times it's like, well, you just need to have faith. You need to close your eyes and jump off, right? But I think there is valid fruit. And I think if you look at Paul's life, you'll see a lot of this kind of like argumentation nature. Like he'd stand in the temples and be like, the Jewish scriptures talk about Jesus as the Messiah. You get it? Right? And he'd like walk with people. And so I think there's a space to do this. So don't be quick to write it off, but also don't go beating people in the head with it, right? Sit in that tension, sit in that balance. So part one, this is called the Columbo tactic. It's based off an old detective from this old TV show, Detective Columbo. And he essentially he'd kind of come in kind of fumbling with his papers. Like you'd have to ask the person on the crime scene for a pencil, and he'd walk up to the suspect and be like, asking some dumb questions, and he'd be like, oh, okay, that's enough information, thank you. And he'd turn away, and then when he turned back, he'd be like, wait, can I just ask you one more thing? And then he'd have a really poised, precise question that would just totally open up the whole concept, right? And because the suspect's unsuspecting, they just kind of answer it straight up thinking that the guy's an idiot, but when in reality he was getting at the truth. So this whole tactic is kind of based around asking questions that are pointed at a means to an end. So essentially, we want to be question askers. When you ask a question, it relieves pressure. It is an honest attempt to understand their view. Like we said earlier, you're not building up a straw man. You have a relaxed tone. You're curious about what they believe, and you're showing interest in who they are as a person. You're showing interest in their background. You're showing interest in their beliefs. And it allows you to do two things with questions. You can have a purpose of gathering information, like what is this person, who are they, what do they believe? And then the other question can be a leading question. So, do you really think that that's a great idea to consider this? Have you ever considered blank, right? And that's kind of a question that helps pull that person along. So questions are an inoffensive way to go on the offensive, right? And so you're not going to send any red flags or piss somebody off because you're genuinely being curious, but you're also at the same time understanding their view. So I basically just said all this. You're not pushy, and it allows you to guide the conversation. Because I don't know if y'all have ever had conversations about your faith with someone with a lot of questions. A lot of times you kind of get thrown back on your heels, right? And you can't really stand your ground or have solid footing because the person's just peppering you with questions, and you're kind of stuck on defensive mode, and you're well, I gotta answer this, but then I gotta answer that, and then I gotta answer this, and you're just kind of going. So this kind of allows you to take a pause and advance the conversation in a fruitful way, and ask a question that has an actual purpose instead of just kind of a smoke screen. So the first question is really simple. You probably ask this all the time. I ask it a lot in math class. What do you mean by that, right? What does that mean? And this allows someone to really express what they believe, but it also makes them have their view laid out, right? And so if they're totally false, or if they just believe something for no apparent reason, this question exposes that, right? What do you mean by that? Well, the same thing I just said. No, but why do you believe that? Just kind of drags it out. But it also allows you to gain a fuller understanding of their beliefs if they have founded reasons, so that you can properly address those. And it's not like you're pushing your view on them. You're just asking them for what they believe. And so you're not preaching at them, you're not hitting them with the Bible. And it also allows you time, if you're in a more intense conversation, to think about your views and collect your thoughts on their statement and further come up with a claim, if that makes sense. So important concept in apologetics is called the burden of proof, right? The burden of proof is the ability or the pressure on the person who made the claim to prove it, right? And so a lot of times people will just make blanket statements, and then we as Christians just kind of allow them to go unquestioned and then be like, okay, I'll address that later. But to get to a further point, right, when in reality these statements shouldn't just be glossed over, right? We can ask, what do you mean by that? And then shift the burden of proof onto that person so they have to back up what they believe, because Christians aren't the only ones that should have to give answers for their faith, right? Because essentially everybody believes something. If you're an atheist, you believe that nothing exists. There should be an evidence for that belief, right? Not just necessarily that there's I don't see anything, so therefore it can't happen. Well, what are your reasons? Lay them out, right? You have to come to an explanation for the world we see. And this goes for you as the Christian too. If you make a claim, you have to prove it. So know your reasons, right? And another question is kind of a little bit just a spin off of the first question, but how did you come to that conclusion, right? And so then this gets someone to walk you through their thought process, right? Well, I first thought this, and then, you kind of take steps, and you get to walk along that process with that person and understand what they mean by their claim. And then I really like this quote. It says, an alternate explanation is not a refutation, right? And so, like, he uses this example about, like, evolution or something in one of Dawkins' books. If y'all know who Richard Dawkins is, he's a really famous atheistic biologist who does a lot of evolutionary work. But in one of the books, he was like, how did we get to flying squirrels? Well, you see, there was a squirrel on a branch, and he jumped from this branch to this branch. And then he did it again, and then over millions of years, as his relatives kept on doing that, they slowly realized, like, the people with longer, little bit more skin under their arm kind of coasted from branch to branch a little better. And so as more squirrels dropped to the ground and died, and natural selection, we see that evolution, and that's how we got flying squirrels. Very probable. Might be how it happened. There was no evidence in that statement. That was a story, right? I didn't cite any sources. I didn't show any fossil records or nothing, right? I came up with a story to satisfy your conclusion. This one comes up a lot in the morality debate too. How do humans get moral? Well, you see, as we evolved, you die if you're alone, so you evolve in packs. So if you evolve in packs, you have to be able to live in packs, which means you probably shouldn't kill everybody or steal, because that'll get you killed. So eventually morality just kind of came around. So that's why it's ingrained in all of us, is because we all evolved from a pack animal mindset. Could be true. What's your evidence, right? And so 3 questions to ask when somebody makes a statement like this. Is it possible, right? Having these kind of imaginations are a great place to start, right? But if we stop at the imagination, we have just a story. We want to understand facts. And so, is something possible? Could it have happened? Could the squirrel jumping from branch to branch happen? Yes, it could have. Great. Now, is it plausible, right? So, is it possible that that happens? But in light of the facts, it probably isn't, right? Is it plausible? So, if I say somebody told me that the sky was green, it technically is plausible that some massive cloud of chlorine gas could have been ruptured or whatever and covered the sky and made it green over their little town or house or whatever. Very possible, right? That's plausible. Have I heard of any chlorine gas chamber ruptures? No. Is chlorine gas deadly and probably would have killed that person? Yes. So it's not exactly the most plausible explanation that we have, right? And then, is it probable? Is it the best explanation we have to fit the facts? So we're not trying to come up with stories that just sound nice and pretty to our ears, right? But rather, is it the best thing that we see? So if we look at the fossil record, what do we see? If we look at the Big Bang, what do we see? If we look at the cosmic microwave background, what do we see? And let's come up with an explanation from facts. So those are kind of 3 questions to ask when somebody states their reasons for belief, because a lot of times you'll just catch that restated view that doesn't have any facts behind it. It's just kind of like a little story that makes them feel good. So now we're going to kind of zoom in on one type of conversation called the professor's ploy. And this is very God's Not Dead movie type of vibe, where the professor's trying to pin the student. And this doesn't really happen at A&M because that's just not our culture. But I've been in situations, I wasn't bold enough to actually talk, but I've been in situations with professors at community colleges that do this. And in general, people can make statements to shift the burden of proof before you claim anything. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about here. So you're in class, professor comes up to the podium and is, talking about ancient mythologies and says, it's just like the Bible, it's a bunch of fables, right? And then you kind of, put your hand up, you're like, excuse me, professor, what makes you say that? The Bible's respected by religions, what makes you say it's a bunch of fables, right? And then what the professor does is he assumes your stance, right? So he goes, oh, well, we got about 5 minutes. And I assume you're one of those fundamentalist Christians that just believes that the Bible's written by man and therefore cannot be or it totally is perfect, even though it's written by a ton of men over a ton of time, and it's not a bunch of stories. So go ahead and explain to class why you think that the Bible should be believed by everybody. What happened there? You didn't say anything. You asked for clarification, and the professor realized what you were trying to do and tried to flip the burden of proof back onto you. Right? But see, if we're not smart, what happens is we recognize that because as a Christian, I hope you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, right? And so if you say that, or if that's what you believe, and they kind of pin that on you, then you're automatically on the defensive. You're like, well, actually, the Bible is because, Isaiah 53, whatever, and you go off, right? But that's not on your burden to prove because you didn't say anything, right? What actually happened was they pinned an assumption on you that you happen to agree with, but they didn't clarify their point. And so you can say, no, actually, I haven't claimed anything. I could be a dead set atheist for all you know. I was just curious for your reasons. I mean, you're the professor. It's your job to educate us. So if you want to be that sassy in your philosophy class, go for it. But see how there's kind of that dynamic of where somebody tries to shift the burden of proof, and you have to be able to be cognizant enough to shift it back on them where it belongs because you haven't made a claim yet. Right, so that's kind of the point we're getting at with this. And now, if you're ever like in a space where you don't feel like you have the answers, or you might be lost, somebody might be like talking over you, you feel like you can't really navigate a conversation well, you're kind of in the hot seat. And a really good thing to do here, this sounds like a dumb tip, but we never think to use it because we're caught up in the flurry of a conversation. You can ask somebody to slow down, like. Our pastor likes to say that he's a 5-year-old, so he needs you to explain his view to him in a 5-year-old terms, right? That's a little thing he likes to use. And so ask them to explain their argument slowly and clearly, and walk you through the entire thought process, right? So that way you have time to form your thoughts, and instead of just kind of getting like steamrolled to where you don't know the right answer and you can't really refute anything and you don't have a view and you're just kind of lost and confused, and you get further clarity on their beliefs, and then you can make analysis if you can actually respond or not. So these are the magic words that kind of like let you off the hook, right? Let me think about that. So if you say, let me think about that, you can walk away, right? And you can go look up an answer, come back a week later and say, hey, I thought about that, right? Or you can sit there for a minute or two, kind of stare at the ceiling a little bit, twiddle your thumbs, and you can think about it, and then you can walk away. Or you can come up with a response, It kind of lets you off the hook. And so if you're ever kind of in that position where you don't necessarily know what to say, someone's just kind of tossing questions at you, you can just kind of like put your hands up, be humble that you don't know everything, and be like, all right, let me think about that for a minute, and just kind of see where you go to from there. So we are going to kind of shift. So like lately we've been talking about how to use the Columbo tactic to understand someone's view and get at like their reasoning and maybe expose flaws within their reasoning. So now we're going to talk about kind of leading the way with Columbo, right? And so we want to use questions to make small steps forward in arguments, right? And so like kind of like think about it like a chain, like you're putting it on like one link at a time, and you're slowly getting to the end of the conversation. So like if I like, Jesus is God and Lord of all, right? Like if I walk into a room and say that, people are just going to be like, well, probably not. Maybe. I might say yes. You might say no. Like they won't necessarily see your argument. But if you're like, okay, we see something, right, in creation, and our evidence leads us to believe that there is a creator. Okay, well, I can get behind that. I can believe that some sort of maybe higher power, like maybe some force that's like outside of everything. Don't know if it's personal or not, whatever. And like that's one step forward in the process. That's one link in the chain. And then maybe the force has to be personal because of da-da-da. And like you build another link in the chain, and you slowly kind of link these ideas together to lead someone to the conclusion that you want to get to. But you do it with small little questions and small little statements to kind of build that argument, right? And so this is probably a dynamic that y'all are all familiar with, kind of growing up. I'm assuming most of y'all grew up in Texas. This question, this scenario is pretty frequent, and like every pastor talks about it basically every other Sunday. But this is going to be an example that I kind of want you to look at and see how somebody led the way with questions and kind of linked arguments together step by step. Not necessarily like their responses in particular, but the way they use questions to link an argument to get somebody to a point. They didn't just hop right to the point, okay? So, Alvin the atheist walks up and he asks Carol the Christian, so do you think that everyone that doesn't agree with you is damned to hell? It's a big question, right? If somebody's listening in, you say yes, right? That's a pretty hot response, right? So you don't want to do that. You instead want to lead the way with small questions, right? And so let me ask you a question. Do you think people who commit moral crimes should be punished, right? Like there's a school shooting in Uvalde a couple months ago. That really angered me. I wanted that guy to be punished. Did you agree with that? Did you think that guy should be punished? You did. Okay, cool. Right? Let me ask you another question. That I double copied the same slide. That's on me. Let me ask you another question. Have you ever committed a moral crime? You ever stolen? You ever hurt anybody? Right? You ever lied? You ever betrayed someone for your own self-interest? You know? Do you think that moral crime should be punished? Right? Because I've done the same thing. I've sinned as well. And so by your own standard, if moral crimes need to be punished, we should both be punished as well. Don't you agree? And then, of course, if they follow consistent logic, they'll have to say yes, right? And then you go, well, this is where the gospel comes in, and we're redeemed by Jesus Christ because he paid our price on the cross. And so notice how they kind of led with questions. It wasn't like yep, 100%, you're right, but rather, okay, so we both agree that, people who commit crimes should be punished, and we both agree that we both committed crimes, so therefore we both must be punished, right? But the gospel is what saves us. And so kind of walking through the logic using questions and getting them to agree to certain points instead of making a bold statement. The third way you can use Columbo is by challenging someone's viewpoint. And these are little things like, have you ever considered, can you explain this a little better for me? Or, I don't necessarily agree with that. Have you ever considered this point? Those kind of sentences are questions, so they're not necessarily like, you're wrong, you're bad, you're dumb, whatever. It's not that, but it is like, have you ever thought about this? You're inviting them into an intellectually honest space to come to a conclusion on a point. You're not hitting them in the face with the Bible, right? And then another thing to do that I thought was an important concept is narrating the debate. So if you're in a conversation, someone like maybe starts to accuse you of something or like kind of like dodge a question, you can be like, okay, so let's talk through this conversation a little bit. So kind of take a step back. So initially you asked me this and I responded with this, but then I asked you this question, right? And you didn't really give an answer for that question. You kind of just asked me another question in response. But I was really curious about what you believed on that last topic. So can we take a step back and maybe go back to this point you were talking about, if that's okay? Because this does happen a lot. I was talking about some Jehovah's Witnesses in Tennessee, and like, oh my goodness, I got sidestepped so many times. It was so frustrating. But this happens more frequently than you think, and you would notice it if you pay attention to like the actual conversation. But it requires you to be in a mental space to do that. So I don't know. These are fun things to do. This isn't going on YouTube, right? No? Okay, cool. So I was in a truck all summer. I was on a survey team in an internship, and the guy that I was in the truck with and I had quite a few theological disagreements. And so as I was reading this book this summer to prepare for this presentation, I just like would sit in the truck with him for hours and just kind of be like, so what do you think about this? Why do you think that? What leads you to that conclusion? See, I don't necessarily understand that point. Have you ever considered this view? But what about this in light of this verse in Scripture, right? And so I just kind of like would pepper him, and then he'd kind of be like, well, I don't really know about that one, I'll be honest. But what about this view, And so you can practice on people, maybe. I didn't say that, but I enjoyed it. It was fun. I think he enjoyed it. Like we were in intellectually honest space. So, yeah, this doesn't need to be posted. So, what do you do after a conversation? How do you get better? How do you improve your skill, right? The best way to evangelize is to go out and evangelize, right? You get better by doing it. And so there's three things you can do to kind of like prep yourself, right? You can anticipate, so you can kind of become familiar with arguments like there's like the moral argument and like the problem of evil and like questions like those. And you can prepare yourself with that information so when a question comes, you're ready. And if you're in a conversation, you think somebody's trying to get at a point and they're about to go there, you can be like, yeah, well, see, a lot of people also, like in a similar vein to you, will bring up this point, but I don't really think that's true because of bop, right? And you can kind of defeat it before it's even out the gate. And then second thing you can do is reflect. And so after you come out of a conversation, what did I do good? What did I do bad? Right? What could I have done better? Was my character like Christ glorifying? Was I rude? Did I interrupt them a lot? Like, did I have the answers for the questions? Did I not? Like, those sorts of questions you can kind of reflect and ask yourself. And then you can practice. You can practice with a friend. The author of this book would, like back in the radio days, would turn on like talk radio, and then like when somebody would come on like the phone and like ask a question, he would turn down the radio and respond to it in his car while he's on the way to work, right? So you don't have to go like that overkill with it, but if you want to, you can. So there's a lot of ways to practice. In fact, you can practice in a safe space, which is what we're going to do right now. So this is part of the little spice up action. So I want everybody, or can somebody give me a topic, just like random topics? Anybody?
The historicity of Exodus.
Okay, like an easy topic.
Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A.
Chick-fil-A. Okay, so I want you to get in partnerships. And I want you to just start off with a random conversation. And without being like an idiot and like, how was your day? Oh, it was so good. I went to Chick-fil-A, right? I want you to kind of navigate the conversation to get to an end, right? And, then somebody else do a second topic. Bubbles. All right, Chick-fil-A and Bubbles. So we're going to kind of take like a little 5-minute intermission, get a partner, and find somebody. One person try to guide the conversation to Chick-fil-A. The other person try to guide the conversation to Bubbles. And so how do you guide a conversation? You ask questions, right? You kind of like, oh, so what makes you think that? Or like, or you bring in personal experience. Like people like, how was your day? Oh, my day was so good. I was busy with this ministry. Have you ever heard of apologetics? Do you know what apologetics is? No, I've never heard of apologetics. Well, apologetics is basically the reason for defending the faith and like trying to connect why we believe that Jesus was the Son of God and died on the cross in our place and paid the price that we should have paid, and see, then you get into the gospel. So split up into pairs, groups of 3, and try to get to Bubbles and Chick-fil-A. Just ask questions, try to like steer the conversation, and I don't know, go from there. So we'll reconvene at like, what time is it? Like 10 minutes? Not 10, probably 5. So like maybe it's 17 or so. So, all right, everybody go.
Nico? I'm Jax. Nice to meet you. F2. Yeah, what up?
That's Army, right?
Yeah, that's Army.
You know what, Lang?
Lane?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's my buddy.
Yeah. And who's
Oh.
last year. It was pretty cool.
Hold up, I turned on like battery saver mode. That might have been what did it. Did it change anything? No? Wait a minute, let's see. Wait, where's freaking night mode?
Weird dynamic, because I'm just coming from like a different.
How do you turn on night mode though?
Just any outfit in general, just like what you do, like their traditions. It's like a lot of things you can't do. Just have it to like
There's like a way to do it, and it used to.
No, it's just that like when I'm so accustomed to the previous outfit, like I just can't do another outfit, or
Yeah.
just like
Yeah, and like it's not on.
little things
So
like
wait.
like how we operate like little minute traditions like that. Not like any outfit like would typically.
Nice.
Is he a freshman?
No, he's a fifth last year. He's a junior. He's an
You know what I used to do at restaurants when I was a kid? When I like, I don't know, have you ever, did you ever like color on anything as a kid? Like you do those like worksheets and stuff? Like, the tic-tac-toe while you're waiting in line? Or, well, dang it, I was about to get there. So what I'm saying is when I was a kid, I would play like tic-tac-toe in the kids menu, but then I'd also like blow bubbles in my chocolate milk when I got it, you know what I'm saying? So like, those types of things. So.
like details like
I wonder if this is like actual curriculum. This is just like a total off. Like, I don't know if it's going to be productive or not, but like getting to an end in a conversation is an important skill to have. But it's hard to be like, hey, practice. Talk about bubbles. You know? I just pulled something. But at least we're talking more during meetings. That's a good thing. Oh yeah. Howdy.
Howdy.
Okay, we're gonna kind of bring it back in. Was this this is just a random idea. Like, was this a good idea? Was it like too easy, too hard? Like, was anybody got any like tips or experiences or like questions that were good that maybe kind of led the way for Bubbles or for Chick-fil-A?
I saw a guy yesterday riding a bike
Yeah.
that shot out bubbles.
Oh, there you go. So personal experience, right?
I literally used the fish from Finding Nemo to bring a bubble in just your chest and bubbles come out.
Oh my gosh, that's kind of wild.
It was a well-planned story.
What's your favorite Pixar?
There you go. Okay, asking favorite Pixar movies. He asked, "What's your favorite Pixar movie?" With the intent of getting to the bubble machine thing.
The fish with the bubble chest in Finding Nemo.
See,
Very specific group.
like
It was very specific.
one of the questions that came up here was like, if you ever like spent a lot of time in restaurants as a kid, like playing on the kids menu. Like things I would do were like color in the person or like play tic-tac-toe or like dots and boxes. But then I'd also like blow bubbles in my chocolate milk, you know? And so like, I don't know. Like stuff like that, you know? Like, because you can use personal experience, you can kind of use leading questions.
True. If the only restaurant you go to is Chick-fil-A, there's just no kiosk.
That's true. There you go. See? So like coming up with creative ways, and I know this is kind of like an outlandish example like Bubbles and Chick-fil-A, but coming up with kind of creative ways to bring in points of conversation. And so a lot of times I'll personally like practice this on waiters or like cashiers or whatever, and I'll just kind of be like, how's your day going? And just try to see where I can get, like how close I can get to the gospel. And my roommate thinks it's stupid and fruitless, but not that rude. But like, I don't know, I think it's a good skill to have, and the only way to kind of develop that skill is if you actually practice it. And like a cashier's not going to care. So like try it, you know? So, one last word of caution before we move on to the next section. Most people aren't really able to give reasons for what they believe. You know, they kind of just inherited beliefs from parents, or like, that sounds nice, I'll think that. So, don't use these like a club. Like, don't use questions just to show how faulty their belief systems are and just like go in on them, right? Expose some flaws, walk through the flaws, talk about how to like move forward, and have an intellectually honest and affectionate conversation, right? Because if somebody's mad in the conversation, you lose, right? If it's you that gets mad, or if it's the other person that gets mad, you're the one that loses because you were trying to steer it. So, watch it. All right, next we're going to talk about finding the flaws in arguments. So these are a couple more tactics, like 4 or 5 more, and they're really brief. It's like one slide on just kind of how to pick apart logic and pick apart arguments within a conversation. So, he has a lot of like out-of-pocket names for these. I didn't come up with these, okay? So that's the reference. So this one he calls suicide, formal suicide, and it's where something is self-refuting, right? The law of non-contradiction. And so the only question you have to ask here is if that claim that they're making applies to itself, right? So there are no absolutes. Is that an absolute claim? Because it sounds like it, you know? Or if men wrote the Bible, so it cannot be the perfect word of God. Well, gee, that's what you just said sure sounds like a statement from a man, so why am I inclined to believe that that's perfect either, you know? So stuff like that. Or we only know truth through science. Well, what scientific evidence can you find that we only know truth through science? You can't. Science is rooted in philosophy. So there's no scientific evidence indicating science, right? It's circular and it's self-refuting. Man, I keep pulling on this cord. So that's tag number 1, formal suicide. The next one's practical suicide. So it's where someone can hold a view, but then can't enforce it, right? And so he gave the example of a bunch of like, there was some, I think it was in Chicago or something, like the Baptist church up there like did a week of prayer for our Jewish brothers and sisters, for God's people to come to know Jesus as the true Messiah, right? Or something like that. And the rabbis that were prominent in the city got all pissed and like got interviewed on television, all this stuff. Like, you know, we have our own religion. Like they should stick to their own. They shouldn't be pushing anything on us. Like they're pushing beliefs on us. Like that's totally wrong. Nobody should ever do that. Well, by saying that, you're pushing your beliefs on someone, because if someone's beliefs thinks that they should push their beliefs, then you're pushing your own beliefs. So you can hold that view, but you can't say it, because the second you say it, like you're not standing on solid ground, right? So that's tactic number 2, practical suicide. So we got the law of non-contradiction, and we got views that you cannot practically hold, or else they drop dead. Another one is sibling rivalry. And so this happens when 2 views a person holds are like logically inconsistent. And so you'll hear this in conversations, like somebody will say something, and then they'll say, like, you know, maybe 3 minutes later, something that seems to be in conflict with that statement. So it's kind of like being aware, and this makes you have to think a lot more during conversations. Like when I was in the truck with that guy, oh my goodness, my brain was tired. But you have to be able to recognize flaws between 2 claims. So, for example, a good God wouldn't let, you know, something like a natural disaster happen, but a loving God wouldn't send people to hell, right? So these 2 claims, one of them is asking or saying that, like, a good God wouldn't, like, punish people and, like, should act towards evil. So, like, if there's a school shooting or something, God should step in and stop it, right? Like, I know a good God wouldn't actually let someone do that to other people, right? But then when God does try to step in and stop evil by sending people to hell and having them pay just price for their sin, we're uncomfortable with it. So we don't want God to punish sin, right? So where's your view at? Do you want God to punish sin, or do you not want God to punish sin, right? I want to be free by grace, but I don't know about y'all, right? So see, they're kind of like, they're in conflict with each other, right? You can't hold both at the same time because your logic is inconsistent. And so as someone interacting in this conversation, you have to be mentally present enough to be able to recognize that and address it and point it out and be like, hey, I think you said this earlier, but it doesn't really make sense. And so being able to navigate that conversation. Another one is called taking the roof off. And this is essentially reductionism. And there's some fancy Latin name for it if you want to go look it up. I didn't want to put it in here because I was going to butcher it and sound like an idiot. So that. Yeah, see? They're the smart ones in the room. I'm not. So if the gospel is true, and if Yahweh is the creator of the world, everybody is living in God's reality, right? Like, if this is truly the Christian world, everybody is in the Christian God's world. That makes sense. It's a double statement, right? So if someone is in denial of that, they kind of have to like build their own roof, metaphorically, of the kind of shield themselves from the reality of God's world, right? And so the idea behind this is you want to adopt another person's view, right? He uses the analogy of a map, right? If we're in LA and like you ask me for a map to San Francisco and I like, you know, sketch one out, take this street, and you up into Mexico, like you're going to be like, okay, something's wrong with what he gave me, right? Because you're not in the right place. And so the whole point of this tactic is you kind of like step into their shoes for a second and you think through what their thought process is and you take it to the most extreme conclusions, right? And so like you take it all the way to the nth degree. And if there's any flaws or like logically inconsistent places or really uncomfortable places to be along that way, you kind of like take it and point those out, you know? Because if somebody holds a proper worldview, it'll get them to the proper conclusion. So if it gets you to a weird conclusion, point it out, discuss it, you know? Allow that person to be more intellectually honest, you know? Jesus does this in Matthew 12. And so he's talking to the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders at the time, that hated him because he was stripping them of their power. And it says, when the Pharisees heard it, they said, it is only by Beelzebub. This is a weird translation. I've heard Beelzebub in the past. The prince of demons, that this man casts out demons. Knowing their thoughts, he said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste. No city or house divided against itself will stand. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will this kingdom stand? But if it is by the Spirit of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come to you. And so he puts in their shoes. They're like, this guy must be from the devil because he's casting out demons. Like, that's the only way to get power from it, right? So just like, okay, let's think about this for a sec. If I'm the devil and I have all my little minions running around the world, if I'm going around like defeating them and beating that up, that would be self-destructive and therefore a stupid idea, right? But if I'm God, that would make sense for me to do, wouldn't it? And so he kind of takes the worldview on, walks it down the path a little bit, and points out flaws in their reasoning, right? And in the middle of this, I skipped this verse, but it's funny because Jesus is sassy. He says, like, you know, by what authority do your sons cast out demons, right? Because the Pharisees claim to cast out demons. And so if they take this logic all the way to their own thinking, that means they're spawn of Satan as well, right? So he just kind of points out all the flaws in their logic. Another tactic is called steamroller. And so people don't often like to change their minds. I don't know if you've ever been in a more heated conversation. It's probably not a great place to be, right? So emotions can get in the way. People can come in with their mind made up. They can be prejudiced. Or they can just be straight up stubborn, right? I know that's sometimes where I tend to land. But the steamroller is the person that's the interrupter, that kind of like peppers you with questions so fast that you can't really answer them. And so you don't have enough time to defend what you believe, and you kind of just get knocked back on your heels. The example I like to use for this tactic is one time. I was 13. I was at the 8th grade Mormon dance for New Year's Eve. It was a wild rager, I know. But this girl asked me to dance, and so we're sitting there talking, and we weren't talking theology or whatever. I was an idiot kid. I didn't know any of that. But she's like sitting there just asking me questions about myself, like name, number of siblings names, what do I like to do, you know, what do my parents do, like all this stuff. But we're like sitting there dancing, and I'm like, you know, awkward trying to two-step or whatever, or like doing the stupid like middle school sway thing, right? And I'm just getting peppered with these questions. And as I'm getting peppered with them, I'm not even like, my sister's name isn't even out of my mouth before like her age is asked. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm like, my sister's name is Maddie. What age is she? Like, what does she like to do? It's like pop, 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 pop. And so a steamroller is somebody that does this. And so before you finish explaining a point fully, you're cut off, and there's a new question on the table, right? So you have to be mentally aware that you're in this situation. You have to be mentally aware that you're at a Mormon 8th grade dance. Okay? So first way to deal with steamrollers is you stop them and you be like, well, hold up. So before we get on to that question, like, let me address this one really quickly. So I was finishing saying blah, 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 right? And then step 2, if they do it again, is to like shame them and be like, so, well, hey, you asked me a question, but you keep talking over me, and that's really not polite. And so it's making me think that you're actually disinterested, like you don't really care about my answer. You just want to ask me questions to kind of put me on my heels. So if it is all right with you, like, would you mind letting me explain my points fully before you ask me another question? I promise I'll get to that question. Just maybe like, you know, put a finger up or write it down or something. And so this most of the time will kind of be like, not guilt trip them in a bad way, but they're like, it'll kind of narrate the conversation and kind of expose the rudeness of it. And if they do it again, you can have them get the last word out and like rip you to shreds and all that stuff. You know, your pride can take it, it's fine. And you can walk away, you know. Matthew 7 says, don't give what is holy to dogs and don't throw pearls to swine. You know, if they don't want your answers in the first place, you don't have to necessarily give them. So you can walk away, and that's okay. And then another tactic is called just the facts, ma'am. And we want to be aware that most objections are based on bad information. Have you ever seen those annoying little tabloids when you like walk out of the grocery store? You know, and they're like all the reports on Jesus, and they're about how like, you know, he was like a sexual revolutionist and like all this like wild stuff that just is totally wrong, right? Y'all ever seen those? You know what I'm talking about? Yes, no, maybe so? Okay. Well, they're based on stupid information, right? And so it's most of the time somebody with a PhD is just making stuff up, and then they write an article on it, right? Like I swear, like all the royal family has been divorced and remarried like 45 times, right? But it's not true. So most objections, if this is the Christian God's world, are based on faulty information because it is the Christian God's world, right? And so we can kind of have confidence in what we say. And so you want to be able to have an answer ready. This is why we have RC, right? Why we equip ourselves like this. And know the correct information. And anytime you know facts, instead of just saying like, oh, I remember some study somewhere where like, it proved that God was real. Like, that's a dumb argument. I'm sorry, right? Don't say that, right? But if you know numbers, if you know answers, be fair to give them, right? And so this was, I thought, was a cool example. So religion is the root of all bloodshed. Well, actually, like, I don't know. Y'all ever seen Penn Jillette? Y'all know who that is? No? Okay. I did magic for like 5 years, so I know who Penn Jillette is. He's a magician in Vegas. He has a Bible that he got cut into the shape of a gun because the Bible is what started all wars. Is that true? No? Okay. So with this one, religion is the root of all bloodshed. Right? You have the Crusades, you have the Jihad Wars, whatever. We should just move away from religion. Well, actually, institutionalized atheism has killed so many more people, right? You have 66 million that perished under Russian communism. You have 32 to 61 million under Chinese communism since 1949. And in just 4 years, 2.7 million under the Khmer communists, right? Yeah, he knows how to say it. But so knowing the facts, having the answers ready is a good way to address problems and kind of these like blanket statements that sound really good, but don't necessarily have the weight behind them. And so that's all of the tactics. I know that was a lot. There was like probably 7 or 8 of them.